Hello and welcome back to another episode of Dark Souls II Dissected. I'm particularly excited about today's video because this is a long overdue follow-up to my How the Gutter Got Gutted episode. Which, if you haven't seen it before, it's not prerequisite viewing, you can watch these in any order. But I will be continuing what I started back then, which is uncovering early level design concepts while overusing alliteration in the video title. This is going to be a little different, though. While there's a bunch of other prototype maps that differ wildly from what we see in the final game, and I'll get around to those too eventually, the Forest of Fallen Giants doesn't have anything like a complete prototype map. But what it does have is the Giants' memories. We can find a bunch of weird stuff there that all collectively hint at more ambitious plans, which likely had to be cut due to time constraints. Welcome to From's Forgotten Forest. Before we dive into speculating on earlier design concepts for the Forest of Fallen Giants, there's something else I'd like to accomplish with this video. I want to try and make better sense of the totality of the area. So we're eventually going to get to a discussion about cut content by way of doing a deep dive into the level design first. And I'm sorry, but there's no easy skipping ahead to a section about cut content that stands on its own, because understanding what was there is intrinsically woven into analyzing the level layout. To have the best context for it, I think we need to do both simultaneously. So observations of cut content are going to be sprinkled throughout the video. Apart from the cut content, one of the main reasons I wanted to discuss the level layout is because there's no version of the level that we get to see in full. In the Giants' memories, we time travel to visit the forest in the past, and while there's some recognizable landmarks, like how the boss arena for the Giant Lord is clearly the same place where we fight the Pursuer, there's also other areas that are unique to the memories that we don't get to see in the present day. If I asked you, where is this, exactly? Or this? Do you have a strong enough sense of the level layout to know where these things are in relation to the Forest of Fallen Giants? It's really not an easy thing to intuit just by playing the game, and I imagine some people are wondering if there's a grander and cohesive level design here at all. For a game known for its slapped-together world design, and having lots of levels that overlap without concern for spatial accuracy, it would have been very easy for From Software to just borrow select landmarks while coming up with completely new stuff for the Giants' memories that didn't necessarily match. But I'm happy to report that this is not an issue here. The Giants' memories do a fantastic job of filling out unseen parts of the level. Aside from some incredibly minor nitpicks, everything here makes sense. The levels complement each other to combine into one larger level that we don't get to see all at once. It's all very cohesive and very well thought out. So before we start exploring its weird odds and ends, let's try and wrap our heads around what the entire area actually looks like. If it's been a while and your memory of the Forest of Fallen Giants is a bit fuzzy, here's a quick recap. Heading down the stream, you'll wind up in this structure, and then travel underneath this walkway until you emerge over here. Then heading into this building, also known as the Cardinal Tower, gets you to the central bonfire. However, if we back things up to that large walkway we emerge from, to our right we'll find the Soldier's Rest area. This is the largely outdoors location with all of the Eternal Knights, where Armorer Dennis invades in Scholar of the First Sin, and where you can collect seeds from this giant's tree. If we turn to our left from that walkway, we'll face the valley below. And the valley runs directly underneath the Cardinal Tower, although it's blocked off from here. And across the valley, we have another giant tree, which grants access to the memory with the Giant Lord boss fight. And lastly, if we kept going straight ahead from that outdoor walkway, we'd also pass the area that has Kale the Cartographer off to the right. We'd pass over this outdoor area that has Pate and the trapped area also off to the right. And we'd finally reach the spot that runs underneath the area where we fight the Pursuer, the location with the giant statues. To recap what this all looks like from an aerial view, here's the outdoor walkway, with the path leading towards the Cardinal Tower bonfire. Here's the Soldier's Rest. Here's the area with the caves that lead towards Kale the Cartographer. Here's the early Pursuer encounter. Here's the proper Pursuer encounter and the bird's nest that takes you to the Lost Bastille. And here's the valley that runs underneath the Cardinal Tower, with the memory of Jeigh Giant over here, and the King's Gate leading to it, which requires coming back later with the King's Ring to open it. Of course I didn't point out every little landmark, but hopefully this helps remind everyone of the basic layout. So where do the Giant's memories fit into all of this? Though it's difficult to align perfectly from a 3D perspective, it looks something like this. While overlapping a couple places in the present-day Forest of Fallen Giants, it mostly fleshes out the left side of the map. Or if we decide that the top of this aerial view is north, we could say that's the northwest portion of the map. What this means is that when we're standing on that outdoor walkway, if we look out to the left over the valley below, the memories mostly take place in unseen parts of the fortress that are further out in this direction. But if you're wondering, how does that make sense with the entrances of the Giant's memories, I should stress that where we find these things has no relation to where we teleport to in the past. Take the memory of Vammar, for example. We find the entrance over here, which from the aerial perspective is located right here. But when we enter it, we pop out in some cave, which is actually over here instead. So this sort of disconnected teleporting around is part of what can make this all very disorienting. Now, I realize that while the aerial view helps bring some clarity to where the Giant's memories fit in, that's not as good as being able to understand all the landmarks as you see them from a normal in-game perspective. So let's finally begin by taking a closer look at the memory of Vammar. So I just mentioned that we begin the memory of Vammar in this cave back here, but allow me to reorient the collision map viewer in order to see it better. We'll be starting back here and heading into the level in this direction. When we emerge out here, we're in the most distant, off to the left area of the Giant's memories, which explains why we can't see any of this in the present day. It's just too far beyond all of this stuff. However, I can still explain where this area is in relation to the present. Here's the King's Gate that leads to the Memory of Jeigh entrance, but off to the right we have this chest on this platform area. I think you know where this is. Looking beyond, we can see parts of the fortress that are just out of bounds scenery in the present day, but it's directly on the opposite side of this building that we'd find that outdoor area in the Memory of Vammar. Here's what this looks like in-game in the past. While our starting location here, where the chest is by the King's Gate, is itself an out-of-bounds location in the past, flying over this wall gets us back into the Memory of Vammar. Or from the reverse perspective, the next time you're here in the memory, you can look back up at this wall and know that flying over it would get you back towards the King's Gate. Here's an approximation of the same location in the present day, and what flying back there would look like. Now in the present day, nothing of this first outdoor area nor the cave are actually rendered, not even in low poly form. We also quickly run into this cliff wall with some trees above, which really doesn't give enough room for that outdoor area. In the past, that cliff wall is pushed further back to make space, and it looks quite a bit different. But I'm not going to count this as even a minor discrepancy between the maps. It's fine. You can't see any of that cliff from down here in the present day, so there's nothing to tell us that that outdoor area couldn't fit back there. You can see that cliff wall when looking over the valley from the large walkway, but it's far enough away that you can't intuitively make sense of how distant it is from the structure nearby. So it's not apparent that it doesn't leave quite enough room for that outdoor area in the past. It's just a low poly, out of bounds earthen structure you're never going to have enough context for just playing the game normally, so while technically a bit different, I wouldn't even count this as a flaw or discrepancy worth noting, beyond just giving us a glimpse into some of the shortcuts that were taken, where they didn't have to worry about every tiny detail being absolutely perfect. Going back to where we left off in the memory, we continue ahead and then turn basically 90 degrees to the left to find the next wing of this outdoor area, where we find the giants and soldiers fighting each other. Because we turned neatly to the left, it's not hard to understand where this is in relation to the King's Gate platform in the present day. Instead of flying over that wall to get back there, we'd simply find it on the opposite side of this wall instead. But we don't have to just imagine it as something that exists out of bounds from this perspective, because this area does start to become visible in the present day. To get here in the memory, we pass under an archway that's found between two towers. Looking across the valley, from either the walkway or the entrance to the Cardinal Tower, we can see those same towers and archway in the distance. Taking a closer look reveals a pretty big difference in its design, though. In the present day, the archway is much taller, reaching all the way up to the out-of-bounds walkway above. In the past, the archway was much shorter, leaving a longer segment of wall above it. This is a discrepancy that's hypothetically possible to notice, however, we can be pretty certain that it's no accident. I don't believe we're meant to overthink it and headcanon away some explanation that these particular towers were rebuilt differently at some point. The differences are almost certainly explained entirely by the visual aesthetic. The taller archway simply looks nicer from this perspective. If the archway was lower, we might not even see it from here without angling the camera down, at which point it'd be kind of cluttered visually, hiding behind some of those trees back there. And in the past, the shorter archway just kind of frames the view into the next area better. So I thought it was interesting that they decided to change how it looked between past and present. It's safe to assume the art direction was entirely responsible for this, and they simply didn't worry about having them match perfectly. One other difference between them is that, in the past, the tower on this side was connected to another tower very close to it. Hypothetically, we should be able to see that tower in the present day as well. It'd be somewhere over here, but I think its absence was to help declutter the distant view. We can also blame its absence on anything else. Maybe this distant view was crafted first, and the extra tower didn't exist yet. Or maybe wanting to have lower poly out-of-bounds structures would also make sense, so removing a more distant tower would help achieve that. And if we really wanted to headcanon an in-universe explanation, there's nothing wrong with simply saying that it's collapsed since then. Having new and completely rebuilt structures in the present day would, in my opinion, be an issue. While we don't know the full history of the fortress between the siege in the past and the present day, there clearly wasn't a surviving infrastructure to repair major elements of the fortress. Things got left in ruins and didn't get repaired. The only new structures that would make sense would be stuff that stands out as being makeshift in some way. But for the opposite, for major structures we can see in the past but don't see in the present, regardless if the developers were actually thinking about justifying that in terms of lore, we always have the convenient excuse of being able to imagine that it's simply collapsed or been torn down for parts. So the lack of the extra tower that we see in the past from this perspective simply isn't an issue. Something else we can see back here out of bounds in the present is this rooftop. It's one of the ones we can climb onto in the past, and details like the structure on the side of the roof remain intact in both time periods. And even though this is pretty far out of bounds and not easy to see, aside from this one angle down here, they also included the other rooftop with the archers shooting at the giants. The way this roof is depicted differs quite a bit more between the past and present. The out of bounds version was a much steeper roof that had these windows on top, while the playable version was made to be less steep so it was walkable. It's also longer. The out of bounds version cuts off right here, while the playable one extends further back. The absence of the longer roof in the present isn't an issue because there's nowhere you can see that from without going out of bounds. But what I find interesting is that if you look at where the building cut off in the past, there is a gap there. A gap that doesn't seem to make a ton of sense with the way the roof is seamlessly connected. It feels like they were trying to convey one longer structure, but were probably modifying the shorter out of bounds version to start with, and the gap is the result of doing a sort of copy and paste job with the shorter building. We can also find some other familiar elements back here. There's this corner over here, and then more importantly, we have this building. The front entrance on the ground is found in the same place, as well as the upper exit. And even some of the loose boards are in the exact same spot. None of the internal structures remain intact, and we can't enter this building at all in the present day, but it's probably the closest we can see into an unreachable yet playable game space set in the past, and I find that neat. Ultimately, the memory of Vammar has us going up these stairs to warp out of the level from this giant's corpse. Is that Vammar, or is this Vammar? I have no idea who these named giants are. Regardless, this tiny corner is the one location inside this particular memory where the playable space of the past and present overlap. It's where we find the entrance to the memory of Jeigh, behind the King's Gate. And there's quite a few details that all line up very nicely here. I find this highly satisfying from a level design perspective. To have us travel through a part of the fortress that is completely different and unrecognizable to us as time travelers, only for us to wind up back at a familiar location at the very end, that's cool. I also want to consider this particular rubble pile that's found in the present. How plausible is it that this wound up here? I'm sure some viewers will roll their eyes if I mention how I can't find a good source for this part of the rubble in the past. Because, yeah, the game absolutely does not need to cover all its bases at that level of detail. That would be absurd. But there's this bit here, and is there a good explanation for where that came from? The neat thing is, there actually is. In the past, nearby on this rooftop, it existed up here. In the present, it's missing. So we have a very solid explanation as to where it came from, and I find that fascinating because I wasn't expecting that level of care being put into justifying what the rubble pile was made of. Though there is a bit of an inconsistency that might cast the intentionality of that in doubt. Not between past and present, but between present and present. From here, the older intact version of that steeple tower thingy can't be seen. Even from closer down here, it still can't be seen. It seems like a really good explanation for the rubble pile, but when we stand here, it comes back into view. Because of how the games use lower poly models and draw groups to cull unnecessary details from a distance, normally the real and proper version of any given environment is the one you see when you're standing in or closest to it. But because these more distant views take it away, and its absence would be a perfect explanation for a minor difference between past and present, this is one time where I think we should just ignore what we see from this perspective and pretend it isn't there. So now that we're somewhere familiar, it would be a good time to turn around. Looking above, we can see the Cardinal Tower in the past, and looking across the valley, we find all that wooden scaffolding in the present day that wasn't previously there. This makes perfect sense to me as the sorts of newer structures that would have been added. The makeshift repairs and walkways that would be added to a fortress that wasn't going to be rebuilt in a major way. One difference in the design here is how that sort of railing area along the top of the walkway looks completely different. I don't think there's a good explanation for this. It probably just comes down to tweaking the designs in such a way where both maps were likely being worked on simultaneously to some extent, without finishing one entirely before the other. That seems extremely likely, and if that's the case, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect a few minor mismatches when one map deviated from a former design, and then it became too much work to implement all of the minor changes in both. So I'm also going to write that off as something that's not a logical change between past and present, it's just something we're not meant to notice. Back to the scaffolding. Why would this have been added at some point later? Well, the fortress wasn't previously designed to have a walkway down into the valley below. That's because in the past, it was full of water, so that wouldn't have made any sense back then. I like how one detail maintained between the two versions here is this particular set of rocks sticking out. They're not a totally perfect match, but I like how what was put here as a barrier for getting out of bounds in the present day was something that developers recognized as needing to stick out above the waterline in the past. And when we stop to contemplate the body of water, we'll find that there's actually some very thoughtful things happening with the level design. There's enough to talk about here that it almost feels like fodder for an any Austin video. We have an explanation for where the water was coming from, because even though we can't find it in the same place in the present day, we do find it here. If we follow the stream, we find that it flows directly towards that valley. So while we can't find water in the same location across the two different periods of time, in combination, they help explain what was going on. It gives a better context for what this strange area with the flame salamanders used to be. Why would the fortress have this weird space underneath it? It's because it originally had water running through it. The doorway here might have been a floodgate of sorts, that would have already been destroyed at this point in the past if that's the case. And at the far end of this lower area, in an out-of-bounds spot we can't normally get to on the opposite side of the elevator shaft, there's a grated gate down there. Where would the water have gone if it kept flowing in this direction? Well, not far beyond this wall, we find the sea. A proper exit for the water wasn't included in the level's design. It's not like you can find an opening in the wall down here for the water to flow from, but in a hypothetical Bluepoint-esque remake, that's the sort of detail I would pitch. I like how this works on a conceptual level. It makes sense to have fresh water flowing under the fortress. It could be harvested for drinking water, or maybe if you dumped sewage far enough downstream, like on the side of the elevator shaft, it would dump out into the ocean. The former presence of water explains the system of caves down here. And if you're thinking about the elevator and wondering how this would have made sense previously if it led underwater, take a moment to consider the structure of the elevator itself. Everything else around here is made of stone. The structures made entirely of wood appear to be later additions. When we bear in mind that the Giant Lord was captured and hidden away in this cave below, a cave that the people of the fortress knew about because it was exposed from the top and they had a tower fall in, I think the progression between past and present looked something like this. The Giant Lord was defeated, restrained, and tossed down into the cave. But having access to the giant could have been important to someone. So they constructed an entrance that was built sometime later than the fortress's initial development. This explains the nature of the elevator shaft itself, but also the crude entrance into the cave where they had to bust this wall open. I'll talk more about the cave in a moment, but I like what this hints at on both a symbolic or thematic level, and also what it means for the literal construction of the game space. There's something fitting about the water being replaced with this. Like, if we're going to represent the decay of a kingdom, a source of fresh water drying up and being replaced by fire monsters is a really cool way of conveying that. Plus, I like how it's subtle. I don't think anyone looking at this for the first time, or even 100th time, will necessarily go, yeah, that used to be a water pit. It's not exactly easy to intuit, but we can puzzle it out. By examining the differences in the map between past and present, we can learn more about the history of this area. We're able to do some in-universe video game archaeology, and that's really damn cool. Now, if you think I'm drawing too direct of a connection between this area's watery past and its fiery present, I think we have some evidence that the developers were actually thinking about it in this way. From the Future Press guidebook, the little bit of lore we get on the flame salamanders says the following. These mysterious creatures serve an unknown purpose, but they are locked within the soldier's fort behind a door older than the kingdom of Jeigh itself. Their fiery presence seems to alter the very environment itself. This door being older than Jeigh is a pretty wild detail that sounds like it'd be very important to what we find down here, but I'll circle back to that in a moment. The important part is the comment on how their presence alters the environment. While I think there could be another explanation for where most of the water went, on a thematic level, they were thinking about this area previously being filled with water, and the presence of the flame salamanders in their stated lore shows consideration for how this environment changed and why it's bone dry now. It suggests that they're probably responsible for the flame pillars coming out of the ground, and the game mechanics back that up. When you defeat all of the flame salamanders, the flame pillars go away. If this area was previously filled with water, it helps reinforce our understanding of the level design in the present. The valley? It's there because there used to be a bunch of water here. This mound of dirt and rubble? It piled up against where a floodgate used to be because water pushed it here. Or at least it was bottlenecked into this opening. The downward slope towards this out-of-bounds area beyond the elevator shaft? It's there because that's where the river was directed to flow into the sea. If you're wondering why there's no water here at all, when the stream still exists, and the flame salamanders aren't all the way out here, that's easy enough to headcanon away, regardless if the developers considered it on this level or not. While it points generally in the direction of the valley, it is slightly off to the side, first heading towards an out-of-bounds area next to the valley. Especially with the way it's been blocked off here, we can imagine that the water was redirected to somewhere unseen, out of bounds over there. In the past, the body of water was wider than just the valley we have today, so water also being back in the out-of-bounds area that connects to the valley isn't incongruent with how it was conveyed back then. And in the past, the river wasn't dammed up where the stream currently is, so we can blame the dam. I realize we're doing a bit of fanfiction to explain the difference between past and present. Some of these elements were definitely thought about by the developers, but when we're getting to justifying a specific rubble pile and where it was sourced from, we may be stretching things. But setting aside developer intent, I like that there's room to reasonably speculate on this area based on what we're given. Let's take another look at this cave. How did a tower wind up in here, and where is this even located? Does this make any sense? And what's the deal with this super ancient door? In the present day, the skylight of the cave would be found out of bounds in this direction, a little beyond and underneath the corner of this building. Let's take another look at the collision data. Here's the location of the cave skylight, and here's the King's Gate platform. We're not off to a great start if there isn't really an open sky above the cave, but what was this nearest to in the past? In the entrance to the memory of Vammar, next to where we find Captain Drummond, we have this rough cave area. There's this side room with a chest in it, and the skylight of that cave would be not far beyond this wall. When we consider what's happening here, we had people digging a little too close to the top of the cave. This area is being heavily bombarded, giants are rushing in and just smashing through walls and stuff. Yeah, I could imagine the cave being discovered during the siege when this poorly constructed mine caves in and exposes it. Were there any towers nearby? This one was pretty close, but it's still standing in the present day. It's the same one we see from here. So we don't have a great explanation for why this is down here. Hey, let's just pretend the presumed collapsed tower from back here was thrown into the cave to help entomb the giant, or whatever. Of course, this is a video game.
Oh yeah, that was a pretty addictive video game.
Video game?
Most video games, including the Souls games, don't really ever aspire to making realistic environments that make perfect sense. If we try applying this level of logic to its landscape, obviously it's not going to hold up. The reality is that it's incredibly unlikely that they thought about justifying the existence of this cave beyond some nebulous understanding that there used to be water down here. But given what we have, a collapse around this location is my pitch for how the cave was discovered and how parts of the fortress fell inside. And since we can't really see where that would be exactly in the present day, it doesn't conflict with anything too much. Plus, they were thinking about the skylight as a source of collapse for parts of the fortress built on top of it. Maybe not with a specific connection to any landmarks we get to see, but it's not just finding a tower inside here that conveys this. If you look closer at the skylight itself, you can find more rubble of the fortress spilling in. But if you're thinking, don't these caves have something to do with the Iron Keep? What's the deal with this area's connection to the Iron Keep anyways? I think it's time for a lore tangent. I don't know if any lore folk have a more fleshed out interpretation of what's going on here, but I'll take a crack at it. I think there's two possible schools of thought on why we have this fiery cave area with some vague connection to the Iron Keep. One is that this area used to be part of the Iron Keep and somehow wound up far away and detached from it. The other is that it isn't, and the connections are explained by something else. I'm much more fond of the latter, but if this area having some connection to the Iron Keep is confusing and you're new to this sort of speculation, allow me to back things up and share the evidence regardless of which interpretation you side with. This door is unlocked by using the Iron Key, which is found in the Iron Keep. The Future Press Guidebook says that this door is older than the Kingdom of Drangleic, and the item description for the Iron Key states that the door that corresponds with the key must have wound up far away from the Iron Keep. So in no uncertain terms, we have a door that belongs to the Iron Keep down here. That's simply a fact of the lore. And behind it we have a bunch of fiery stuff, so there's a thematic connection of some kind. And in Scholar of the First Sin, this flame pit houses the Heavy Iron Key, which is what grants access to the old Iron King DLC. So clearly the developers intended for this area to have some kind of connection to the Iron Keep, but what exactly they were going for is hard to pin down. This may very well be the remnants of some half-baked idea from earlier in development that didn't make perfect sense in the final product. But before we write this off as vestigial content without purpose, let's take a look at two possibilities here. The first idea is that this used to be a part of the Iron Keep. Another thing mentioned in the Iron Key's item description is the lore of the Iron King's castle, which is that it sunk into a lake of fire. Like Icarus flying too close to the sun, in their hubris they built something too heavy on top of a volcano. Oopsie. I think some people like to look at this area as part of the Iron Keep that sunk into the earth, but that doesn't quite sit right with me. The Iron Keep is very far from here, but is that inherently a problem? Not necessarily, there is wiggle room here. We have reason to believe that the lands of Dark Souls distort and change over time. This eventually culminates in the transitory lands of Dark Souls III, which severs Lothric from the bridge to the Undead Settlement. It's what allows Anor Londo to wind up in a setting unrecognizable to Lordran from Dark Souls I, the Earthen Peak from Dark Souls II winds up somewhere completely else, and in the far future, shit gets all fucked up because of this. But I do think that Dark Souls 3 stepped in to retroactively clarify that the lands have always had this sort of transitory property. We're seeing a much more severe and accelerated version of it in Dark Souls 3, but it explains why the Sunlight Altar from Dark Souls 1 is found again in a really weird place in Dark Souls 2. Important landmarks having a sort of magical ability to persist and tug the lands of powerful souls into converging over time is just a fact of the Dark Souls cosmology. And if we wanted to explain this fiery area as something that broke off from the Iron Keep and wound up somewhere completely else, it is said to be older than the Kingdom of Drangleic, so maybe a portion of the Iron Keep has had enough time to move somewhere far away. Something about this doesn't totally pass the vibe check for me, though. Sure, we can accept that the old Iron King predates Vendrick and the Kingdom of Drangleic. He's referred to as the Old King, after all. But was a part of the underground of the Iron Keep old enough to have been moved around significantly, as if it's almost as old as Lordran? That may be, but there's just something kind of weird to me about the idea that the Iron Keep remains this intact overall, like it sunk partially into a volcano maybe centuries ago, while a drastic transformation happens to one small weird bit of it to move it to underneath an unrelated fortress that winds up on top of it in the future. So here's an alternate hypothesis I'd like to present. The Iron Key's item description also says the following. Over the ages, the iron was stripped away from the castle by the opportunistic passers-by. The iron door, too, must be somewhere far away. So a lot of iron was stolen from the Iron Keep as it lay in ruins. While Drangleic strikes me as the kind of society capable of producing its own iron, why start from scratch when a previous kingdom did it much better, and you can largely get by stealing and repurposing vast amounts of it that were left behind? If iron was taken to be used elsewhere, I think that's the explanation for why we find this here. Drangleic denizens stole a door made of iron and used it down here. So it's not that the basement of this fortress predates the rest of it, they just used stolen materials from the Iron Keep. But why the hell would they bother? This feels like a random place to use what was probably a pretty expensive door, having to be scavenged and imported. So I'm going to circle back to my hypothesis about the Giant Lord being kept alive. Why keep this one giant alive instead of killing him off? It seems likely that someone like Aldia would have wanted to be able to do some research on it. If we think about this location being converted into an Area 51-like protected government lab, it makes the surrounding area make a bit more sense. Flame salamanders were imported to block off the caves and paths that could get you in here without having to sneak through the rest of the fortress. And when you have flame salamanders that would burn all of your wooden doors, and maybe even melt your inferior metal constructions, why not use those fancy doors from the Iron Keep that can withstand lava? And perhaps the rest of these iron bars were sourced from the Iron Keep as well. So that's my pitch as to why this is here and what the Iron Keep connection is. The flame salamanders were brought in as guard dogs of sorts, and materials from the Iron Keep were used to withstand them. I realize this was a pretty long tangent, but when talking about what we find down here, I would be remiss to not talk about the nature of this fiery cave area. Since some people already think of it as a former part of the Iron Keep, I wanted to stress an alternative explanation that really has no bearing on the timeline of the construction of this fortress. This basement area being developed further after the attack of the giants can still make sense despite having stuff in here that's reportedly older than Drangleic. So I don't believe this doorway nor the hallway predate the Soldier's Fortress. The only connection to the Iron Keep, in my opinion, is that they use its technology to help reinforce the security of the last giant. Before we move on to exploring the next giant's memory and looking at its context, we have a few more things to look at in the memory of Vammar. Instead of trying to unwrap the differences between the past and present in universe, we can also look at the giant's memories to try and suss out some differences between past and present in the real world. When we start going out of bounds or looking at the map data, we can find loose ends that hint at how the area's design evolved during the game development process. One landmark we haven't looked at yet is this building in the distance, which we can see at the far end of the walkway, beyond the old body of water. It's of course the same structure we walk through to enter the Forest of Fallen Giants in the present day. The biggest difference we'll notice is that it used to have a roof, which isn't a design discrepancy at all. The implication is that these massive branches or vine-like things burst through at some point. One discrepancy we do find, however, is that the placement of these arches is different. It's like the whole building is rotated a bit. This is one of those things that makes no sense to try and headcanon. It's almost certainly just like the walkway being different between past and present, the result of tweaking the maps in such a way where the final design between the two levels wasn't perfectly synced up in every aspect. Something kind of tantalizing about this, though, is how there used to be a bridge up here in the past time period. And if we go out of bounds to take a closer look, we see that it leads to a path that no longer exists in the present. Is this our first evidence of a present-day Forest of Fallen Giants that was supposed to be different originally? I'm not entirely sure. I don't think this supports that very well, as the bridge was already broken in the past, and so it seems unlikely that there was ever meant to be a path up here in the present, as that would require building a new bridge. And in the present, there's also no remaining evidence of a path that would have been up here. But one connection that's fascinating to me is how the broken bridge is very near to this makeshift one that crosses the stream. It's almost like it collapsed and provided materials to cross the stream almost directly underneath it. It's a good match conceptually. Visually, not at all, because the present-day bridge is made of whole logs, while there's nothing like that in the collapsed bridge. They're so close to each other that I think this probably was intentional, but it also feels like a rough implementation of that concept in a way where we're not supposed to think about it too literally. This was something we were only supposed to see in the distance, after all. Anyways, since this was probably always meant to be collapsed, and I don't see this out-of-bounds path as something that was necessarily meant to be traversable by the player at any point, that doesn't mean there isn't anything else back here to hint at the game's development. I was informed by Moonlight Ruin that if we look at the map data, we find a sphere encompassing this structure in the past. What is its purpose? Well, it's an unused object that was meant to contain boss music. That's pretty weird. Were we supposed to fight a boss back there in the past, too? We can also find unused objects for a four-armed giant, who is known as the Giant Guard Captain, whose soul would have rewarded us the Giant Stone Axe. So the Giant Guard Captain was certainly intended to be a boss, and while we don't have any evidence to tie it to any specific location in the game, an unused giant boss in an unused Giant's Memory boss arena seems like a really good fit. And considering how the giant's corpses were turning into weird tree things, I don't know if it's a coincidence that the giant having 4 arms has anything to do with these large vine branches being sourced from 4 branches. Okay, that's probably a stretch, but they were thinking about making this a boss room in the past, and that's pretty fascinating on its own. But then, speculating on whether the set piece was iterated from what was previously a corpse of an unused giant boss, whoever makes those iceberg conspiracy theory images needs to update the Dark Souls II ones to include the Giant Guard Captain's vine corpse at the very bottom. Something else to consider, how would we have gotten to this boss room? Was this also an unused interaction point? Most of the giant's memories have us traveling around a bit. Making a different one where you just warp inside one specific room for a boss fight and can't travel anywhere else is of course totally possible as well. But there is another candidate I consider to be more likely. I sometimes wonder if the tree where you can collect giant seeds was also meant to be a warp point into another memory before it got repurposed, and if that's the case, it'd make a lot of sense when we consider this. The Giant's memories also contain unused event location boxes in the area of the Soldier's Rest bonfire, and also outside the cave area where we find Kale. There's also a few things out here that are labeled as test enemy in Japanese. And you know this out-of-bounds cave that we can't get to behind the Soldier's Rest area in the present day? In the Giant's memories map data, there's an unused map piece for its interior. It looks to me like we're missing an entire Giant's memory over here, one that would have taken us through this area, and maybe it could have connected back up to the unused boss room. In fact, I think this unused cave would have been the path to the boss fight, which gives us a pretty good link between the cut boss and this area in the past. If we follow the path of the unused cave, it leads up to a broken bridge that would have led straight towards the boss arena. So while I'm doing some speculating here, this is almost a smoking gun as far as I'm concerned. They modeled the interior of this cave for the Giant's memories, and we can see exactly where it was headed. There's even an early trailer for Dark Souls II, which, for a split second, shows an alternate version of this building that wasn't all covered in that sort of green moss yet. We can spot a doorway there which no longer exists, further evidence of this previously being an intended path. While I don't have anything to support this directly, I think I have a general idea on how they would have repurposed these areas to have a different progression in the past. Because the whole gimmick of going into the past is being able to explore these areas in a different manner, and we have a really good candidate for how they could have done that. In the present day, despite being right next to each other, the area outside Kale's cave and the Soldier's Rest area are two distinct locations. We can't travel freely between them and can only enter them from different parts of the level. Yet we have unused event locations that span both of these locations in the Giant's memories. And in the present day, on the ground level, there is this unopenable gate between them. So my pitch for how this would have made sense as a playable space in the past is that we could have started somewhere on the side of Kale's cave, with the boss room being the end destination over there. This gate would have been open, allowing us to travel directly between these locations, and then we have this cave path here that would have led to the boss. And there'd be room for other differences here. Maybe this area wouldn't have been flooded yet. Maybe that's a result of redirecting the river elsewhere? We also have all these makeshift wooden structures, which we don't usually find in the past either. So it's easy to imagine how this area lended itself to having a different design and progression if they made a version of it set in a Giant's memory. As it stands, this unopenable gate here in the final game still serves a useful purpose. Because you can see through it, it helps inform you that there's other parts of the level to get to if you haven't already. But if you haven't seen it yet, I made a video about how so many of the dead ends in Dark Souls 1 actually led somewhere earlier in development. It's pretty clear to me now that we're seeing the same thing here. Yes, it's nice to have this here to tease out other parts of the level, but the reason it's here in the first place is most likely because they were setting up a gateway and cave that were meant to be walkable. I also find it interesting that in the past, we have this very specific structure that doesn't exist in the present day. It's oddly detailed and contoured if it was just meant to be a completely out-of-bounds landmass we were never meant to interact with. It really looks like a traversable path of some kind. And when we bear in mind that each segment of the Giant's memories has us finding an exit to warp out of, and if this area was previously going to contain a boss arena, it seems like a pretty good candidate for an exit to me. Defeat the boss, exit through this side of the building, drop down a couple small ledges, and then there could be an exit warp point at the end of this path. And for a completely out-of-bounds area, the view from here as is surprisingly decent. This is how it's already rendered from the nearest in-bounds location in the memory of Vammar. Sure, we can see through some walls from this perspective and the detail is a bit basic, but while it would take a lot of work to complete other unfinished areas, this vantage point is not one of them. There's a really solid foundation for making this view work, which to me, improves the plausibility of a hypothetical previous intention of being able to stand here. Let's also take another look at the fire pit. Because we can't get a good look into the fire pit in the past, they didn't bother hiding their tracks and removing these older designs. We can just see it directly by going out of bounds, something I missed in my out of bounds exploration video, but thankfully I'll get it covered here now. Here we have an opening with some rubble, where the elevator shaft will wind up in the future. And off to the left, we have this platform of some kind with a couple wooden boards, making a small bridge to it. There's nothing like this at all in the final design. Moving forward and beyond where the elevator shaft will be in the future, we find some more platforms down here, which are connected by a short ladder. So in the final design, we only have the very top and bottom areas to explore in here, but this prototype design was going to offer some additional platforms at a middle altitude. Also find it interesting how this gate down here winds up being some out-of-bounds detail that's easy to miss in the present day, but here it would have been much closer to the explorable environment. I wonder if this was ever meant to be explorable in the final design as well. While we can't normally get back there, not only does the ground have collision, but it's covered in nav meshes as well. As I mentioned in my recent video about the invisible walls of Dark Souls II, it's not normal for out-of-bounds locations to get nav meshes. So for the one other place in the game where we know of this happening, I was reminded by the modder drop-off that that was meant to be a traversable space in the prototype version of that level. So when we see how they were previously designing this area to allow you to get closer to this gate, and nav meshes still managed to wind up down here in the final product, I think it makes for pretty good evidence that not only were they considering allowing you to go down here, but that they were also tweaking this consideration pretty late into development. And here's something that's probably just a coincidence, but I still want to point it out. There's this pile of scrap here, whose primary purpose is to stop us from doing a diagonal jump to get to that chest and the King's Gate area early. But when we look at what the scrap is made out of, it's clearly the starting materials for another elevator, as we have some chains and even a pressure plate here. Bearing in mind that getting down there was a previous intention, finding an unfinished elevator here feels like it could be something. Like, as they ditched the idea of going down there, maybe they still had something like an elevator around here in mind, and repurposed it to be unfinished and an obstacle instead. And that's not all. We have additional evidence for this area's design being altered. Let's take a closer look at the original gameplay reveal demo. While much of the discourse surrounding the original gameplay demo is the obvious downgrade in lighting and textures in some places, I want to take a moment to call out the changes to the environment. To start with, the entrance ladder we find here isn't seen in the alpha. It's instead off to the side, connecting to where the scaffolding should be. Given how we can't see anything like an entrance to the area from the outdoor walkway, and that the ladder is connecting down to a different part of the level, the entrance we know today might have not existed at all at this point in development. For all we know, the Forest of Fallen Giants was developed in isolation, and a connecting path back to Majula might not even exist yet. Textures aside, most of the Cardinal Tower fire pit looks the same. While stuff like enemy and item placement isn't too integral to the discussion on the level's layout, I do want to take a moment to give a shout out to the loot corpses down here in the alpha build. Their placement was originally more eye-catching. You can still see some items down here in the final release, but they're at angles that are more awkward or difficult to see from above. The placement here was more alluring, and since these aren't things that would contribute to the area's performance in a negative way, I don't know why they changed it. Anyways, we can see that the rubble pile blocking the ground level entrance was modified. In the final game, it's pushed in more and has more debris covering it. In the alpha, it seems to ramp upwards in the opposite direction, and has less debris and is mostly earthen. So we'll take this as a win for the final design, which in my opinion is a much better match for water being down there in the past and flowing into the building. We'll also notice the absence of this cave entrance in the alpha. It could just be somewhere else in the room out of view, and this would make sense given something that we can see in the Despair trailer for Dark Souls II, which came out almost a year before the game. Credit to Celtic Lord for bringing this to my attention. There's this weird cave path scene here that's unrecognizable to anywhere else in-game. Though, when we consider that most of the footage from these early trailers is from the Forest of Fallen Giants, and we can see some flames in the distance, which are reminiscent of the fiery cave, this narrow cave does seem like a pretty good candidate for an entirely different cave path down there, which would explain the absence of the cave entrance we should see from the final game. Going back to the IGN video, we can also spot a couple things that are completely different about the area by the elevator shaft. In the alpha, it had these sorts of guardrails protecting it. But more importantly, just beyond the elevator shaft, there's a bridge here that's been completely removed. I suppose that's how we would have gotten to this chest on the other side, instead of having to go around through the locked door. When we look at the out-of-bounds geometry in the Giant's memories, we can spot another broken bridge where the elevator shaft winds up. So we went from having a broken bridge here that got removed, to a makeshift diagonal bridge over here that was then also removed, to having no bridges on the side of the room at all. Another curious aspect is what happens when the player walks beyond the makeshift bridge. In the final game, it's more or less a straight path to the outside area. In the alpha, the player has to go down some stairs. They wind up in a room where they have to kill a rat dog, and this leads to a short hallway. They step out onto this lower platform area, and then turn around to go back up another set of stairs before winding up in the same place. While this area with the lower platform is completely different than what we see in this out-of-bounds area, I believe that just like the removed bridges, it shows us an evolution in moving away from this design. They had the idea of going down to some lower platforms that took you pretty close to the bottom. They got rid of them, but then found another way to have you go down a little bit, but not as far. And then they got rid of that too. I think it's a bit of a shame that we lost some of this. The diagonal bridge had some detail and looked like a pretty cool set piece. And this lower platform seemed like a nice little detour as well. On the subject of other lost details, we also have stuff like the ladder in the Cardinal Tower, also previously having guardrails. And for the floor of the Cardinal Tower, instead of just being a set of tiles that are uniform throughout the room, not counting all of the destruction and growth disturbing it, in the alpha build, there was something like a path to the bonfire, with tile work distinct from the rest of the floor surrounding it. But I do want to pump the brakes a little on framing all of these changes as a downgrade. It's easy to talk about cut content with a sort of longing for it. The fact that we've seemingly lost an entire giant's memory with another boss? Yes, there's definitely stuff in here I wish we could have gotten. Then there's the obvious stuff, like the downgrade to the lighting, making the graphics less pretty, and so on. Though we shouldn't be too quick to assume that everything about this was better, and that the only differences relate to them gutting the complexity of the area. They had to cut some cool stuff that was in the works, but even if we had a time machine, there's no point where we could go back in time and find a more complex version of the Forest of Fallen Giants. I wish we could get our hands on this alpha build to really understand the full extent of how the area's design evolved. But what I can say with a really high degree of confidence is that, obviously, the alpha was horribly unfinished. The final game did get more detail and complexity, it was just distributed in different ways. While we lost this guardrail by the ladder, the floor around it was flat and pretty basic. The final game replaces this hole with one that's caused by roots tearing through the area, and the ground surrounding it is uneven and disturbed. It's more detailed. This spot down here previously had a doorway with an iron gate blocking it, but now there's a more bespoke hole and rubble pile here. The walkway to the Cardinal Tower was barren, and the structure in the distance didn't have all the roots coming out of it, something important for why it no longer has a roof in the present. There's environmental storytelling that's missing in the alpha. Roots dismantling the area, which probably has something to do with the Fallen Giants, is a concept that was deepened for the final product. There's also this spot out here. There's a bunch of rubble over there from the floors above having collapsed. It blocks off an unseen part of the fortress, and when we defeat the Pursuer, it gives us a space to drop down into to collect some loot. This just didn't exist yet in the alpha. What we find there is a staircase and platform that appears to be a mirror image of the opposite side of the hallway, the staircase and doorway leading towards the Pursuer. While it does look like this doorway was probably blocked off by a small bit of rubble in the alpha, what this means is that the blocked path was conveyed with just a small patch of rubble, compared to the final game where we got all of this instead. It's not hard to imagine an alternate universe where stuff like this collapsed floor area and the roots tearing through here were cut content, and then we'd be talking about their absence like it's a shame we didn't get the original version of the level. I'm not saying there aren't specific spots that feel less detailed in the final game. There absolutely are, that's what gave us the false promise of a game with better graphics. But the alpha had the benefit of focusing on making a small area look good when everything surrounding it was surely very incomplete. I would encourage you to go back and watch the E3 gameplay trailer with this in mind. It becomes very obvious that they didn't have a lot of great locations to get footage from. Maybe some of that is born from not wanting to show too many locations, but it really feels like half the shots in the trailer take place in a small radius of the Cardinal Tower and Soldier's Rest. Like there just wasn't much else to work with that would have been trailer ready. I'm not saying that anyone was wrong to feel let down by the promise of a stronger graphical aesthetic from the early trailers, but I just want to add some nuance to the narrative that it was all just cut, and that the final release was stripped of all detail that the alpha had. Game development is messy, and the final release had some changes that might be underappreciated. Okay, let's get back to exploring the area, and take a closer look at the memory of Orro. The memory of Orro is accessed at the far end of the rooftop beyond the Pursuer, which is a little confusing because this is very close to where we spawn in the past in the memory of Jeigh. But again, where we enter and where we wind up are unrelated, so where does the memory of Orro actually begin? If you have a hard time recognizing what you see when you look out of the windows here, this is familiar territory. This platform over here, this is the same area that I keep using as a reference point, the area by the King's Gate. So once again, we can look across from here in the present day to help us understand the placement of locations in the past. The memory of Orro begins inside this hallway that's out of bounds to us in the present day. We start at this end, facing in this direction. Let's continue on here. We When you go up the stairs, you are heading up to the other out-of-bounds hallway that we can also see in the present, which would of course put you over here and facing in this direction when you reach the second floor. Let's continue on again. When we go up the next set of stairs, we wind up on the rooftop up here. Looking back down from here in the memory of Orro, it's not hard to recognize the King's Gate platform. But if you look closely from here, the King's Gate itself isn't rendered, and the doorway appears open. When we get to the rooftop, we have to immediately turn around due to this massive rubble pile blocking things off. This means that everything straight ahead and to the left on this rooftop is out of bounds in both time periods. The level instead continues in this direction, and the rest of the level takes place on the opposite side of this wall. And here's something else to help orient ourselves. This taller wall across the courtyard below is the opposite side of that area with the pursuer and the giant statues. Despite traveling through each giant's memory separately, they're designed as one big map file, and going out of bounds from here will allow their memory of Jeigh to load without issue, so this helps show where we are in relation to that. Now try to follow along as I make my way to the exit warp, because I'm going to ask a question when we get there. Consider this location. We can see a door behind this giant, but do you know where this door is? We can see the opposite side of this door in the present. Pause the video if you'd like some more time to try and figure it out on your own, because in a couple seconds I'm going to show it. It's this door over here. I find it really cool how these things line up, because it's not at all obvious that they do, and there's probably very few players who've ever looked at this and thought, oh yeah, the memory of Orro Courtyard is on the other side of this. Of course, it's not surprising to see some details that don't line up perfectly between past and present. The burning flags and treadmill cranes are no longer around, that makes enough sense. Out here by the King's Gate, you may have noticed this Drain Lake insignia that's up on the wall. This is accounted for in the past with a sort of placeholder or slot for it, but it lacks detail. Being an out-of-bounds location, I don't consider this a mismatch or a mistake. You can see it, but we don't have a very clear vantage point of it in the past, so it's not like they needed to bother. Eagle-eyed players may have noticed that by the King's Gate in the present day, there's also another Drain Lake insignia in what looks like a kind of random location on this wall over here. In the past, this is depicted with a detailed insignia as well, and we find that its placement feels less random because it's centered over a giant door below. This highlights another mismatch in the area's design, one that I don't think we can headcanon away. There aren't doorways depicted down there in the present day, but if they were built over or removed in some way, we should expect something more makeshift and not something that blends in seamlessly with the walls around it. Really, the simplest explanation is that this is an out-of-bounds area where they didn't flesh out its details as well as they did for its design in the past. In a hypothetical, more detailed remake, I think we should see those same doors in the present. Where would those doors have led? Nowhere in particular, it's all out-of-bounds stuff. This one points in the direction of this outdoor area in the memory of Vammar, but it runs underneath it. Seeing how continuing along in this direction eventually gets us towards the body of water, and how my current headcanon for the stream winds up in the present day is this out-of-bounds area that points vaguely in the direction of those out-of-bounds doors, and how this is a lower area that runs in parallel to the area underneath the Cardinal Tower, my pitch for what these doors should be is that they're also floodgates. This could be an alternate spillway if the area underneath the Cardinal Tower gets too much water. Envisioning a modern remake, how I'd enhance the view of this area in the present day is that I'd also include a small, kind of dead stream barely trickling along between the two doors down here, a subtle continuation of the water we find upstream. The memory of Orro is a well-contained area where I couldn't find any hints of cut concepts or unused areas. It makes good use of out-of-bounds locations seen in the present day, but as we make our way to the memory of Jeigh, we'll start finding some of that weird stuff again. As hinted at earlier, the memory of Jeigh is probably the least confusing reuse of the space between past and present, so I probably don't have to spend a lot of time clarifying where this is. The Giant Lord boss fight simply takes place in the location of the Pursuer boss fight, but we progress through the area in reverse, with the sea to our left instead of our right. We can even see the head of the statue get blown off, and it rolls into the position that we find it in the present day. One obstacle not seen in the past is this collapsed tower, but we do have an explanation for where it came from. This building used to have a tower above it, and they did remember to take it away in the present. So, similar to how the head of the giant statue got blown off, we can just imagine this tower being struck in a similar way after we leave. To bring up again the stylistic mismatch inherent to all of the giant's memories, perhaps we have no better example than what we find immediately to our right after passing through the fog gate. We find a segment of the top of this wall that looks completely different. This is how the entirety of this wall looks in the present-day Forest of Fallen Giants, so we can see where they missed a spot when departing from that look. If you're wondering why they would go out of their way to make the past and present more dissimilar than they needed to, your guess is as good as mine. I suspect they wanted the visual tone between the two time periods to differ. Perhaps if they looked too similar, the impact of the areas feeling different due to the passage of time might have been lessened. So while the change in look isn't a logical form of aging, it could be one that they were hoping to work on a subconscious level, not expecting the player to compare side-by-side screenshots. And if that was the thinking, I'd say it was probably pretty successful for the vast majority of players. Though if you were unfortunate enough to notice, like me, you might have to suppress the mental image of the entire fortress being rebuilt brick by brick with different sized bricks, which is of course not an intended implication here. The entrance to the memory of Jeigh makes use of a small space we can't get to in the present, which is blocked by a pile of rubble. And despite the rubble sealing off this area so fully that we can't see any of the stairs that should be below it, we'll find that it is included if we go out of bounds. From the entrance of the memory of Jeigh, we can see this out of bounds area. This is one of the two wings that extend out beyond this area, which both exist roughly the same and are both out of bounds in the past and present. In the modern day Forest of Fallen Giants, we get a very similar view of the other wing on the opposite side. Yes, I am going to refer to these as the left wing and right wing. If you don't like this naming convention, I'm just letting you know where you can go to get affordable healthcare. Here's what the view towards the right wing looks like in the past. It's where we exit the level. In the past, we also have a set of iron bars here for some reason. I don't think this placement makes too much sense. They're just trying to stop us from continuing down into the area that leads to the pursuer. They're here for gameplay purposes, and I don't think we're supposed to think too logically about their presence or absence between the two time periods. But once again, if we go out of bounds, we get to see more of the room that normally leads up here. But what about other unused spaces? I believe the memory of Jeigh also hints at unfinished content that didn't make it into the final design. If you've seen my video about the invisible walls of Dark Souls 2, pardon me as I summarize some of my findings I talked about then, but I do have a couple newer observations to point out as well. This other giant statue that still has its head on, I believe that in the past it was originally planned to have a path inside it, which would have led to other unseen parts of the level. The doorways on the statue still exist in the form of low collision, revealing hints of an unused path. Here I'm going to enter the upper path, and then turn around and descend to show the lower path that points back in the direction of the fortress. And when we consider the statue's placement, it's alongside a tower behind its shield we don't get to go inside, which itself likely would have connected to a hidden middle floor. What do I mean by a hidden middle floor? Bear in mind that this area down below, which runs parallel to the rooftop boss arenas above, isn't one floor below the rooftop, it's 2 floors down. We can find an unused space between them if we go out of bounds in the middle of this drop-down area. It's the same space where these hollows ambush us from when we walk onto the giant sword. In the past, we can also find some simple textures representing a portion of this space. With an unused path from the statue pointing in this direction, this feels like the start of something that wound up being left unfinished. But that's not all. Here's something I didn't talk about in my Invisible Walls video. What about these out-of-bounds wings? There's not much to indicate in the present day that this might be cut content, but there is a good amount of detail out here. I like this area with a broken roof where you can see into a room below. And then, both of these wings lead towards collapsed towers. The towers aren't fully detailed inside, there's missing stairs and whatnot, but it's not as empty as I thought it would be, including stuff like textures for landings that would lead to different floors. The two wings are almost perfect mirror images of each other, but if I had to pick one that seems like a better candidate for cut content, it's the one on the opposite side, the right wing. Because if we look at how this tower is designed, there's no entrance to it. Our way in would be blocked. But on the right wing, there's more scaffolding which creates a path that connects to it. And on this other wing, it's blanketed with a large nav mesh. Again, out-of-bounds locations almost never get nav meshes, so this is pretty good evidence that they were playing around with the idea of putting stuff out here. But this nav mesh is really basic. It kind of floats above the level geometry and isn't crafted to match the space very well. However, in the Giant's Memories, we do get a much better nav mesh over here. Instead of being a really basic rectangle, it follows the contours of the rooftop. And it even has a drop-down nav mesh connecting to the former roof of this tower. While in the present day, the collision out here is very basic and doesn't show us much, there's more detailed collisions in the Giant's Memories as well. Both low and high collisions exist for parts of this tower, including functioning stairs, something else we don't expect for distant scenery. And if we could go down it, it'd have the potential for leading to other floors we haven't seen before. Though even this unfinished version blocks the stairs off, so maybe just this wing itself was being considered and not the floor space underneath it, but the floor space underneath could have connected with the unused middle floor by the giant statue, so who knows. I should also add that the right tower is less destroyed in the past. We can add this to the growing mountain of evidence that they were planning on making it a playable space in the Giant's Memories. And while the Despair trailer doesn't show us anything too different about the unused towers at the ends of these wings, it does include a couple shots of the player standing out there. I have a feeling they were just using whatever locations they could for shots in the trailer, and that these were still just out-of-bounds locations at that time, but still, it's very interesting to see the player standing around in places that we're speculating to be unfinished content. The first shot shows the player standing out on the end of the left wing with the inaccessible tower, and then this next shot shows them standing out by the right tower looking towards the left wing. We know the exact spot they were standing because of this board here. It's still here in the final game. And it's the standing by this board that gives me confidence that this area was never more complete at any point earlier in development, because to stand that high requires standing on the current collision the area has, the one that floats above the environment. So for the devs collecting this footage for the trailer, it's not that this was neatly explorable for them either. They were hanging out in an unfinished area as well. Maybe the trailer footage was recorded at a time where they still had more ambitions for this area but just hadn't gotten around to it yet, thinking it would be explorable later, or maybe the concept was already scrapped at this point. The biggest difference between the trailer and now is that the skybox was completely redesigned, where it looked better from this vantage point in the trailer, though I don't consider this a downgrade only because we can't get out here normally. The placement of the sun was changed, made to be unobscured by clouds, and the whole area was given a warm yellow glow that was meant to be seen from the boss arena. Though I do find it interesting that touching down with a collision out of bounds changes the lighting. It doesn't bring back the original skybox, but it probably is the same lighting parameters of the trailer, bringing back that bluer look. And though this doesn't relate to the overall level design, I think it's worth considering another environmental detail that was probably meant for here. There's an untextured, unused object called Giants in the Sea. Here, Moonlight Ruin textured them and modded them back into the sea, which is kind of horrifying. I can understand why they got rid of it. These were probably meant to be in the distance, but if any part got too close or if you looked at it for too long, it'd be weird that they're all just standing still and completely unanimated. So in addition to this static object, they probably would have had to put some giants in the water that were closer and animated if they wanted to convey giants crossing the sea and attacking, and that seems like a lot of effort. So that effort was likely simplified by not bothering and just conveying the conflict with a bunch of broken boats in the water instead. Even though this object is cut content, when the lore talks about the giants crossing the sea, I'd like to think this is still a somewhat canonical depiction of how that went down. Vendrick thought he had the safety of crossing the sea to steal something important from the giants, seeing this would be something like a moment of karma, realizing how badly he messed up.
Now you fucked up! Now you fucked up! Now you have fucked up!
So to recap, we have an unused boss arena which likely connected to the Soldier's Rest area in the past, unused paths inside the statue, unused space out over by the right wing, and possibly a set of unused middle floors unexplored out here as well. While it's possible that the Giant's Memories were always meant to be segmented as they are, the hint of more stuff being planned for the past makes me wonder if the original concept was something else. What if it was previously meant to be the entire level as one cohesive thing without any time limits? There isn't any direct evidence for this, and when I say the entire level, I suspect that the concept was to always have us weave in and out of parts of the level that sometimes overlap with familiar locations, and adjacent locations that are sometimes new to us. So I'm not suggesting that the entirety of the Forest of Fallen Giants was ever meant to be explorable in the past, and certainly not in combination with the new areas being added. However, the idea of all the different parts of the memories being as segmented as they are starts to feel a bit strange if it was more fleshed out and you had even more locations that nearly connect to each other. Which raises this bit of speculation that Moonlight Ruin brought up when I was talking to him about all of this. it doesn't seem unlikely that the past could have been originally envisioned as one bigger level. Though I haven't talked about it before, time travel was something more heavily stressed in earlier drafts of the game. There was a cut time crystal thingy that was featured on the website, there was unused dialogue relating to it, and we would have run into a child Emerald Herald who is a slave being sold by Gilligan. Yes, we dodged a bullet on child trafficker Gilligan. Visiting the various memories is all we have left of this time travel concept, something that was more central to the narrative of the game earlier in development. Seeing more unused ideas for the Forest of Fallen Giants in the past speaks to a very ambitious design goal that they couldn't fully keep up with. It would have been a lot more work to make one single, larger version of the Giants' memories, and segmenting it seems like something that could have stemmed from salvaging the work they put into this idea without fully finishing it. While I said that this was just speculation and there really isn't direct evidence for a singular Forest of Fallen Giants level set in the past, here's one small thing that could possibly be a remnant of this. It's another shot from the Despair trailer. It shows the exterior of the Cardinal Tower in the past, but it has more details, like these flags, which can't be seen anywhere in the final version. We can also see more stuff at once than is normally possible with the exterior of the Cardinal Tower rendered. There's a good chance this is nothing, it could just be the natural result of optimization. Since the Cardinal Tower is out of bounds to us in the past, and we can't ever see things from the vantage point of the trailer, it makes sense that a view like this wouldn't be maintained. But I still wanted to bring it up, because I had that fleeting thought nonetheless. Maybe a more cohesive view of this vantage point was created in the first place, because perhaps we were supposed to have access to more parts of the level in the past. So that about wraps things up. I should quickly mention that there's more to look at when it comes to the evolving design of the giants as well. There's some very weird unused enemy prototypes, including a massive giant that was supposed to attack you from over castle walls as you progress through the area. It's pretty wild stuff, but I don't really have anything to say with regards to how they might have fit into the Forest of Fallen Giants. So I'll link to a couple of videos by Zuli the Witch that already cover this, and some posts from Moonlight Ruin as well if you'd like to know more. One other change between past and present I didn't stop to mention is how the past used to have all these distant towers surrounding the fortress, nowhere to be seen in the present day. I don't really have anything to say about them, it's just random distant scenery. If you want to try to come up with an explanation for why none of them are still standing in the present day, go for it. Otherwise, I just wanted to take a closer look while closing out the video. Maybe scratch that itch if you ever wanted a closer look at these things. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. All of the engagement things help me out a ton, they really do. And if you'd like to support me more directly, you can support me on Patreon or by becoming a member on YouTube. I'd like to thank Moonlight Ruin for all of the usual help and feedback, and an extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Irinar, Basileus, Bodmanford, Bodmanford. Anyone, please feel free to correct me on the pronunciation. Europa, Gary Marshall, Inciaratable, Jack Gerhart, Kakaruma, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Matt, Ronax, the Majalis Duo, Willpower Smith, and Zelther. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.